Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. In a recent episode entitled, Is Christianity Making a Comeback?, Bishop Barron discussed the good news that apparently, and it's important to emphasize apparently here because the data is still preliminary, apparently there has been a 2% drop in the number of people who identify as nones in the U.S., that is, people who claim no religious affiliation at all. Now, if true, and if this trend away from disaffiliation holds steady, this is indeed a heartening development for the church in the United States. At the same time, it's important to recognize that parts of the global church have a very different kind of challenge on their hands. Not how to address decline, as we see in the West, but rather how to handle explosive growth. The church in many parts of Africa, for example, is not only running out of room in their seminaries and convents and monasteries because of rising vocations, the laity are collectively practicing their faith in ways that puts the church in the West to shame. Upwards of 94% of Catholics in Nigeria, for example, go to Mass every week. 94%. Here in the U.S., we can't even crack 30% of weekly Mass attendance among Catholics. So what explains this wide discrepancy? What factors are at play? What are we in the West getting so wrong about evangelization? And what is the church in Africa getting so right? Here to help us discuss these and related questions is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, welcome back to the studio. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
So today's topic I'm really excited about is talking about the great success, evangelical success of the church in Africa. But before we turn to that, what have you been up to recently?
A lot of things, but what's most in my mind is the wonderful day where we dedicated the new chancery office. So we moved our headquarters from Winona, where it's been for the past 100 and some years, up here to Rochester. And we, through the generosity of some wonderful people, managed to build this really lovely chancery office. We talked, I think, before a bit about the chapel, which is just glorious, but the whole building is lovely. And we decided to have a formal dedication. So it was on a Sunday afternoon. And we had no idea who would come, if anyone would come. Well, about 600 people came to it. It was packed, yeah. And I gave tours of the chapel. I did like 3 or 4 tours in a row. And there was tremendous enthusiasm. And then I wandered around the whole building. There were people all over it and in my office, in our conference room. And I just loved the enthusiasm for this project because I saw the chancery as a symbol for the whole diocese of kind of new life and a fresh start. So I was just delighted with that.
So today, Bishop, as I said, we're looking at really marveling at the evangelical success of the church in Africa. And before we turn to some analysis of why the African church is doing so well and what we in the West might be able to learn from that, I want to give some statistical context to the topic. So according to research examined by the Catholic journalist John Allen, a contributor to our own Evangelization and Culture and a great friend to Word on Fire, when you add up the amount of weekly Mass goers in the African countries of Nigeria, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of Congo alone, so we're only looking at 3 African countries here, you get 80 million souls in the pews on Sunday, which is 25% more than, get this, all of Europe and all of North America, including the United States, combined. Yeah, right. So John ends the article with these words. He says, in much Catholic parlance, it's long been said that Africa is the future of the church. Looking at the numbers in terms of who actually shows up, however, Africa isn't the future, it's the present and has been for a while. So Bishop, does Allen's conclusion here that Africa is already the future of the church match with your own perception of how things have been going in the global church?
It does. And, I think we're filming this, I think it might appear actually when I'm at the Synod over in Rome. Last year at the first round of the Synod, something I said, I believe was in the small group, maybe a little less provocative, but I said, why are we so obsessed with the church in Germany? And there is this obsession, the synodal way and what are the Germans doing and the bishops and the church is dying in Germany. And I said in our group, why aren't we studying the church in Nigeria? Because I just read the stat, I think at that point, that 94% of Nigerian Catholics go to Mass every Sunday. But that was the point I was making, maybe a little too provocatively. But are we obsessed with the West? And I've just read an article by John Allen recently on the Pope's trip to Oceania. And the title of it was something like, the Pope isn't going to the peripheries, he's leaving the peripheries. The point being, if anything, we become peripheral, we in the West. So look at those stats from Europe and North America. Where's the church really alive? I go to Africa, parts of Asia. That's where it's growing, where the people are going to Mass, where seminaries are filled. Why aren't we as a synod, I'll say it again, studying the church in Africa and saying, what can we learn from their experience?
So related to that question, which is not just a rhetorical question, it's a very important question to ask. Are you seeing Africa's numerical strength within the global church translating into ecclesial influence outside of Africa? Are you seeing, for example, the historically Eurocentric church actually listening to the concerns and priorities of the African
I think it's
church?
just starting.
It's just starting.
Look, go back to the Synod on the Family back in like 2015 or something. There was still at that, I think, a fair amount of this European condescension toward the church in Africa. Like, oh, that's great. You're doing so well, but, we're not really here to listen to you. You're here to listen to us. Come on. As I remember, I won't name him. This came from a German theologian. Those days are past, seems to me. Why are we pandering to the German theologians? I'd rather listen to a theologian from Nigeria. Someone who's reflecting creatively on that lively church experience. Because, now you and I are both trained in theology. One of the problems is that theology became too exclusively an academic discipline, and it was divorced from the ecclesial reality. David Tracy talked about the three publics, of theology, and one of them is the church. And I felt for a long time that that's the public that we've ignored. Theologians ought to be reflecting on the life of the church. What's the Spirit up to in the church? Well, heck, I'd rather listen to a Nigerian theologian than a German one, frankly.
So let's now turn to examining some of the possible reasons for why the church in Africa has been so effective at evangelizing, with the goal of pulling what we might be able to learn from them and to apply here. So the first lesson is how the church in Africa maintains the primacy of the supernatural. The primacy of the supernatural. Bishop, these are words that you've used on several occasions. What do you mean by that, and why do you think that giving the supernatural primacy is so important for evangelization?
Right. It's the number one thing, I believe. Look, the church announces God's existence. It announces Jesus as the Savior of the world. It announces the fact of salvation that comes to us through the sacraments. It announces the holding out of eternal life as the goal of human existence. All of that is supernatural. You take the supernatural out, the Mass collapses, the Eucharist collapses, the sacraments collapse, true evangelization collapses, and it becomes a this-worldly project. One of my pet peeves when the word mission is used, I've now come to say, what do you mean by that? What is the mission of the church? Because in certain circles, it tends to mean the political and social amelioration of the poor. Well, that's all a good thing. I'm in favor of it. But that's not the mission of the church primarily. The mission of the church is to announce the word of salvation. Now, mind you, an implication of that is our commitment to bettering our world. Of course it is. That it expresses itself now in love and care and working for justice and all those good things. I'm in favor of it. But the supernatural comes first. When you reduce the supernatural to the natural, religion collapses. It flattens out. It becomes less than compelling. I think what you see in the African churches is precisely this primacy of the supernatural quality of the church. That makes it grow. Because another problem, Matt, is if you're naturalizing the supernatural, you end up with a church that is an echo of the wider culture, not a word of invitation or challenge to it. It's an echo to what you hear in political and economic circles and so on. The church has a distinctive message. It's a supernatural message. When it says that clearly, people are compelled.
So what do you say to the response that someone may say, well, I agree with you in principle, Bishop, the primacy of the supernatural as a theological matter. That must be the case. But, the problem in the West is people just aren't going to be receptive to the supernatural. So we have to sort of dissolve the supernatural into natural categories in order to get any traction. What do you respond to that?
The problem with that is that we bought into the assumptions of liberalism in theology, going back to Friedrich Schleiermacher and others and coming up into the 20th century. And the basic move there was to naturalize the supernatural. And we kind of convinced ourselves, oh, that's the way the world's going to listen to us. It's just the contrary, seems to me. It's just the contrary. The world listens to us when we declare our message. The other thing, too, is, the church's job is to declare the gospel in season and out. But my primary job is not to get the culture to like me or respond to me. It's to declare Jesus Christ risen from the dead. Sometimes the culture will be open to that message. Other times it won't. It doesn't mean you pander to the culture or change the message to accommodate the culture. Look at Paul in the Areopagus. He declares the resurrection and 99% of his crowd walked away. Does that mean he stops proclaiming the resurrection? So no, we shouldn't play the liberal game of trying to naturalize the supernatural so as to make it appealing, when just the contrary is the case. We're more appealing the more supernatural we are.
Yeah, it seems it's been tried and failed.
Yeah, it seems to me.
There's an empirical case for it. So the second lesson we can learn from the African church is holding fast to theological and moral orthodoxy, which we could colloquially describe as not deviating from church teachings. Bishop, why in a general sense is holding fast to all, and I emphasize all, church teachings necessary for effective evangelization?
Yeah, I'm with Cardinal Dolan, and we've used it as one of our principles called affirmative orthodoxy. So the correct belief, orthodoxy, but presented in a way that's affirmative. It's not, here's what we're against. It's, here's what we are vibrantly for. And orthodoxy is precisely that. In the intellectual order, the moral order, in the order of beauty, it's saying, here's what the church is for. When we do that confidently, we are compelling. We are compelling. So as long as you add affirmative to the orthodoxy, I think in some circles, there can be a sort of fussy or defensive orthodoxy, it's over and against. I would tend to say, no, bring it out in its integrity and its beauty, and people will find that compelling.
So we noted before that it's important not to change the substance of evangelical content. But is there an argument that the signs of the times should compel us to change the means by which, or the forms, or the modes of expression we use? Is there a space for that?
Sure, and call that healthy enculturation. And the church has always done it. The church has always assimilated what it can from an environing culture. I've used the image before, maybe from Newman, about an animal moving through its environment. It has to resist certain things. It can't eat and take in everything, or it'll die. At the same time, it has to assimilate what it can from the environment. Otherwise, it will die. So the church, as a living organism making its way through history, does just that with every culture. It affirms what it can. It resists what it must in order to stay alive. And that's a subtle game. The more simple-minded approach is either total absorption, total resistance. And it's neither. It's a canny engagement, we'll use that word, of the culture. That's both positive and negative. But that's true in the church's involvement in any culture. So
you brought up the term enculturation. As you know, Bishop, enculturation, as it's used in many theology departments in the West, means that in order to gain traction in a culture that's not already somehow habituated to the gospel, we have to withhold certain parts of the faith, or maybe even leave out or exclude certain parts of the faith in order to have any hope of evangelizing at all. What do you take to that kind of approach to evangelization?
Well, I would look not abstractly at it, but at the great evangelists. Like, what did they do? How did they do their work? And, you might say, I'm going to lead with something because this culture is oriented a certain way. I'm going to take some aspect of Christianity. I'm going to lead with that, but so as to bring them eventually into the whole of it. But maybe it would be a cultural faux pas to lead with part of the Christian thing that is very antipathetic to a cultural form. I have no quarrel with that. That's, I think, part of the canny practicality of the prudent evangelizer. Whether it's Patrick in Ireland, or it's Boniface in Germany, or it's the great European missionaries in Africa. And again, look at some of the most successful. Think of those Irish missionaries that went into places like Nigeria back in end of the 19th century. What if you told them, that a century from that point, there'd be this explosive growth of Christianity in Africa? They were pretty canny. They were pretty effective evangelizers. So there's a difference between the essence of the Orthodox faith and then the manner in which we propagate it. And the second one, calls for some prudent judgment.
Connecting this directly to the African church, one of the challenges that the church in some parts of Africa has in evangelizing is the practice of polygamy.
Yeah.
And yet, across the board, the church has been very clear that's not allowed and will not be accommodated.
No, that's a very good example, you're right? And that came up at the synod last year, I remember. So it's not like some pandering of like, oh, sure, we just think your culture is great. The church very clearly spoke out against. And look, at the risk of being provocative, look at the reaction to the statement on gay blessings. The great resistance came from Africa. It came from the bishops of Africa who just said, Holy Father, I think I know what you want to do with this, but it's not going to fly here. And it's so antipathetic to our culture that we're going to say no to it. And I think the Pope acknowledged that. And the Pope acknowledged, yeah, you're right, this is not workable. So they certainly were, that was a very interesting form of cultural engagement, wasn't it, around that issue?
Yeah, and we see again empirically that the church's stance on that issue in Africa has not led to a decline in people going to mass or vocations.
Right, on the contrary. Yeah.
So a third lesson we can learn from the church in Africa is being committed to evangelizing the wider culture, which we could also summarize as sort of being committed to Christianizing the culture. Bishop, as you know, the term evangelize the culture is central to the work that we do here at Word on Fire.
Yeah.
How do you define what it means to evangelize not just individuals, but an entire culture?
Right, that comes, from Cardinal George and ultimately from John Paul II. And then before John Paul, I go back to Vatican II, I think. I think it means to bring the word of the gospel into places where a culture is formed. So that would be entertainment, it would be government, it would be the arts. You're always evangelizing people. You can't evangelize abstraction, so you're always evangelizing people. But are there people who are playing pivotal roles in the formation of a cultural matrix? And can the church address those arenas? Can the church find a way into those? And for us, it's through the media. It's been a way to do it. Establishing conversations with key cultural players. That's been my instinct. But the church wants to declare the lordship of Jesus to every individual and to the institutions of a culture that shape the way we think about things. Does anyone doubt that our culture is, to a large degree, in the grip of this sort of self-invention ideology? We have to get in the way of that. We have to resist that. We have to reach out to those who shape the culture. And that's I think, difficult but very exciting mission.
Bishop, in previous episodes and in a lot of your evangelical work, you've highlighted a sort of two basic instincts that we have as a church. That there's a tension between them, maybe a productive tension, but certainly tension. And that's on the one hand to hunker down in response to the culture, and the other is to dive in.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that's playing out both in the Church of Africa and here at home?
I probably wouldn't know enough about the African situation on the ground, but I think the rhythm between those two things is a mark of the church's engagement with the culture. I always think of John Paul II as a young man, literally hunkering down in the basement of the archiepiscopal residence in Krakow with the underground seminary, and they had the culture had turned demonically opposed to Christianity. The Nazis and the communists. So he had to hunker down, and sometimes we have to do just that. But then when the propitious moment arrives, the one who's hunkered down now goes out. That's the rhythm. You don't remain in the basement. The purpose is to go out to the wider world. I think what's interesting about the African church, and you see it as I travel around the world, is now Africans moving into European and Western and North American places, and they're evangelizing in a fresh way. I have African priests in my diocese who have come from their own countries to re-evangelize our country. They're all over Europe. That's kind of a beautiful rhythm in the life of the church. The Europeans went out, they evangelized Africa, the explosion of the faith, and now as it's not dying, but it's certainly declining in the West, the Africans come back.
Would it be accurate to say that we should hunker down so that we can sort of dive back in, to connect them that way?
Yes, it's always go out to all nations. That's always the command of the Lord. The hunkering down is always, it's subordinate to a larger purpose.
So the fourth lesson we can learn from the African church is that unlike the church in the West, especially in the United States, it seems to have imbibed the wisdom that as a church we should praise in public and criticize in private. Praise in public and criticize in private. In other words, the church in Africa seems to do a much better job at maintaining a united front in relationship to the culture. Bishop, what's your sense of the damage that Catholic infighting, especially online, has done to our evangelical work here in the U.S. and the West more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that because I think it's devastating. Again, I go back to, I mention Cardinal George all the time when we have these conversations, but I remember it bothered him enormously. This is back in the 90s, maybe, or early aughts. And it was at the time, Cardinal Ratzinger and Cardinal Kasper were having a public disagreement about the nature of the church, and it appeared in the pages of America magazine. Now, Cardinal George loved Cardinal Ratzinger, and I think he had respect for Cardinal Kasper, but he went to Rome one of his trips, and he spoke to both of them and said, you should not be disagreeing about this in public. If you want to have this conversation, exchange papers privately. And I use that as an example of what you're talking about. That was a very high level kind of academic discussion. But he thought it was disedifying to the whole church that two cardinals would be disagreeing about a basic issue. Now, bring it down to the internet kind of level, and you've got Catholics across the board, in mean-spirited ways disagreeing with each other. There's nothing more counterindicated when it comes to evangelization. If someone goes on one of those websites, they want to find out more about the church, and that's what they see,
right,
is all this petty, mudslinging and name-calling. And no, it's horrific from an evangelical standpoint. We should present a united front over and against a secular culture that is, often aggressively hostile to us. If we're fighting among ourselves, we're like the orcs in Tolkien, right? The orcs, even though they're ferocious, they're very ineffectual because the minute they try to get organized, they start fighting among themselves.
Yeah,
and
right.
Okay, they're posing no threat to us. So a church that's always at war with itself is ineffectual.
What's your advice for how we can handle substantive disagreements? So you gave an example, very high level among church figures, but what about at the lower level, especially when we do have some online who may be propagating untruths, who identify as Catholic and may be presenting the faith in a way that is inaccurate? How do we handle that productively?
Maybe communicate to his bishop.
Okay.
So if there's someone who's saying something really egregiously wrong, write to his bishop, wherever the person's based, and say, I'm really concerned about this. I wonder if you could, talk to him. So use the kind of Matthew 14 thing. Is always begin, at the more local level first. Begin in a quiet, constructive way first. It's almost certainly counterproductive to start hurling invective and com boxes, So I would say talk to the guy's bishop.
We're also up against the reality that conflict generates engagement, and engagement generates money.
And that's one of the demonic elements of it. The dark powers, of course, they use everything, and they used it that way. Absolutely. That we're encouraged to do the very worst things, and we're discouraged in doing the best things.
So a fifth and final lesson from the African church takes the form of a moral virtue, and that's being courageous in the face of opposition and even hostility. So I just want to give you a little bit of context for this, some statistical context. So according to Vatican News, and I was shocked to learn this, over 50,000 Nigerians alone, Catholics, have been killed because of their faith over the past 15 years, and 18,000 churches have been burnt in the same time period. So what, Bishop, can we learn in the West about this tremendous show of courage of the church in Nigeria and in Africa more broadly?
Yeah, and what a tragedy that is, huh? But earlier we talked about, Tertullian, right? The blood of martyrs, the seed of Christians, and you see it again. Is it one reason why the Nigerian church is flourishing? Is that it's courageously standing fast, for the faith. And the martyrs have always had that effect. Now, that's not to glorify martyrdom as like, no, it's tragic. I mean, that's a tragic situation. But the courage of those martyrs, and I've known some of them. I've taught Nigerians over the years. I've known a number of Nigerian priests. And whenever I meet a Nigerian, I'll say, oh, you're from Holy Nigeria. I'm an Irishman. And we used to say Holy Ireland. And please God, Ireland's still a holy place. But I mean, Nigeria strikes me now as a place of real holiness in the life of the church. And maybe they're, in God's providence, playing that role. They're kind of a martyred church. But that's the church that's showing forth the power of the cross.
So a very direct way of asking this question is should all of us as Catholics be willing to die for our faith?
Sure. It doesn't mean for a second that it's easy, and please God, we don't come to that pass. But yeah, I mean, follow me, the Lord says, take up your cross every day and follow me. And his path leads to the cross inevitably. So we all bear our cross in some way. Some are called upon to do it in the most radical way possible.
So before we turn to our listener question, I want to get your thoughts on some of the counterclaims that some make to diminish or even disregard the success of the church in Africa, especially in relation to the West. Some say, for example, that the reason the church in Africa is flourishing is because there's a lot of very poor people in Africa, and the poor tend to be more religious. And it's just for that reason. It's economic reasons. It's a reason of a lack of education. Let's say
it's splendidly condescending, isn't it? It's splendidly patronizing, and coming from like a Western perspective. As I mentioned, I think we saw that at the Synod back in 2015, a tendency of Western people to kind of pat Africans on the head, like, well, isn't that charming? You're doing so well, but, when you reach our level of sophistication. No, I think it's so much nonsense.
And connected to that, in the same category is the claim that there's so many priests and religious and nuns, not because there's genuine religious fervor, genuine Christian conviction, but because this is an economic route for these individuals to get out of poverty.
Yeah, meet some of them and tell me that's true. Talk to Nigerian seminarians and priests and tell me that's true. That there's just some poor, ignorant people that have no other path in life. Come on. Again, that's Western condescension. And that African countries like Nigeria or Kenya, would not have access to, through the internet and so on, to the Western culture and economic possibility. I think that's false. But I would say talk to seminarians and priests from Nigeria.
It does seem interesting that those who most publicly proclaim to be interested in the margins in the church, I'm talking here of theologians and perhaps public influencers, are the ones who are who least know on the ground the actual experiences of the seminarians and the members of the church that, for example, you've met.
Right. If you're just sitting in a faculty lounge talking about the marginalized, you're not going to say very many true things about them. I hate that kind of condescension. I think we should turn that around. I think, as I mentioned, we should be attending to the African church. We should be sitting at their feet and saying, what can we learn from your obvious success? Right. Again, it's beautiful that the church flourished there because of European missionaries. Thank God for them. These largely European missionaries that came to Africa and awakened the faith there, beautiful. Now, in God's lovely providence, maybe the tables have turned a bit, and we have a lot to learn from this now flourishing church. Good. That's the way it works in the kingdom of God. But we certainly shouldn't cling to our own stupid prerogatives.
And a final, and this one I think is less polemical, counterclaim, is that the reason the African church is doing so well is they just haven't had the onslaught of secularism yet, but they will. And once they do, they're going to go the same route the West has.
I don't know. Again, that's an old hypothesis, too, from the Enlightenment, the secularization thesis.
It's inevitable.
Inevitable. And it's been proven false over and over and over and over again. So they were saying that back in the 17th and early 18th century, that as the secular thing moves forward, religion will fade more and more. It hasn't happened. It happens sometimes in certain cultures like our own, but then it's lively somewhere else. And it's been proven, it seems to me, false over and over and over again. I don't know why we still take that thesis seriously.
Well, now it is time for our listener question. Bishop, today we have Anna from Connecticut asking about how best to observe the Sabbath as a whole family.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Anna from Connecticut, and my question is about keeping the Sabbath holy. I've got 2 little kids at home, and it seems like there's always work to be done around the house. What are some practical tips you have about really practicing Sabbath rest as a family?
Yeah, I like that question a lot. And I've often remarked that in the course of my lifetime, that's changed so dramatically. When I was a little kid, Sunday was an entirely different day. It felt different. We did different things. The very fact that everything was closed, and I remember that vividly. Gas stations, we wouldn't see a movie on a Sunday. The movie theater was closed. You wouldn't go shopping. The stores were closed. My father would get tell my mother, oh, you better get the shopping done by Saturday night because everything's closed. Well, see, that was helpful in many ways. It drew people into a different frame of mind. First of all, and here's my first way to answer the question, go to church. The most important thing to do on the Sabbath day is to go to church. So get the family together, go to church. Now, we're talking about Africa in this one. My African friends have told me this, that they smile at us, that if the Mass gets like 1 minute longer than about 49 minutes, we all get upset. They're saying, come on, in Nigeria, the Mass can last 2 hours. And then it's followed by a big, festive celebration, which is then followed by more prayer in the afternoon. It's like an all-day affair. Good. That strikes me as a good way to do it. So I don't know, like with your kids, take the time maybe to read from a children's Bible or read some text from a saint or something. Prolong the experience of Mass in some way. Make sure that the meal is at a heightened level of sacredness on the Sabbath. So I think in all those concrete ways, but we should fight for Sunday. Sunday's been lost to a large degree, and that's tragic. The kids are practicing baseball, the malls are all open, gas stations open, go see a movie on Sunday. That's repugnant to what the Sabbath ought to be.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. Well, we've come to the end of another one, Bishop. Thank you, as always.
Great, delightful, Matt. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.